Today's guest is Ritwik Dey, a longtime designer. He's done a lot with UX, product design, graphic design, all kinds of design. He's currently a design director at Medium and has previously worked at Spotify and a few other places. So, Ritwik, please take it away. Tell us a little more about yourself.
Oh, I just want to say thank you for having me. I don't know what made you do that, but I'm here to talk to everyone. Thanks everyone for being here. I was telling Tor earlier, just wanted to kind of show everyone what I'm wearing. Do you recognize that, Tor?
Yeah, I do recognize that.
So this is just like trivia for everyone who's attending here. Tor and I went to school together. This is like, I think the shirt is from back in 2005 is when you designed it. There was a t-shirt design competition for the department. We were in design and technology, and Tor made this shirt that actually won. It's probably the oldest piece of clothing in my closet right now, but I thought I should wear it for the class here, so they know where you're coming from.
Yeah, I've worn mine to class a couple times too. So
nice. So cool. It's nice to see everyone. You wanted me to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from, right? So yeah, I'm a design director at Medium right now. I focus primarily on the creator side of the platform. And what that means is I head up design for anyone who's producing content on the platform. So that is individual writers, bloggers, people who write for publications, people who run publications, editors, and so on. So basically like tools for all of them that manages their workflow. My team's responsible for the actual editor, the piece of software that you write your Medium post in, and pretty much everything that lives around it. I've only been at Medium for about a year and like 3 months or so. We're a pretty small design team. I manage 3 people. And I deal with maybe a handful of other like designers who sit on other teams across the board. And let's see what else. Prior to Medium, like Tor said, I was at Spotify for about 5 years. I was their principal designer in New York. And there too, I worked with artists and artist managers. So like creators has kind of been my focus for the last couple of jobs I've been working at. Before that, I was at Amplify, which was kind of in the education technology space. So we were designing software for kids like K through 8, and like dedicated tablets that had this like custom software for interaction that happened in class, one-to-many, many-to-many conversations, and so on. So enabling teachers to kind of do their thing. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. Before that, I was in agency land, which in design terms translates to like sweatshop.
The RGA sweatshop. So at Medium is it's a pretty big deal in sort of blogging and sort of the new media journalism space. And so you're designing the interface for people to contribute the content, to like manage the content. That's what your team's doing?
It's mostly content creation. I guess you could say management is part of it, but I don't know what you mean specifically by management.
Well, okay, let's just say creation then. Let's just say creation. Okay. So what, if you can talk about it, what is your day-to-day job like managing that, or doing the design and UX for that?
So given that I'm a design manager, and I've kind of worn both hats, I think Medium is small enough where, like most tech companies, there's an individual contributor track, which is like you're the design expert, you're actually producing the designs. And then there's like the design manager track where, you're not maybe so much producing designs every day, but you're kind of managing the people that do. And I've worn both those hats in the past. And I kind of like, when I switch jobs, I tend to flip flop between like being a manager and just like being a designer, because I like to stay close to the craft. I chose Medium specifically because it lets me do a little bit of both.
Nice.
Like I said, I manage 2 designers. So like first and foremost, my job is to make sure they have what they need to do their jobs to the best of their abilities. And that involves you know, keeping all like as many distractions as possible off of their tables. Like I'll kind of like, if you want to talk to my designers, you have to go through me. That's kind of what I do most of the time. Um, and a lot of that involves like managing up and down. So I'm talking to like my boss, who's the head of design, and her boss, who's the CEO, and understanding, where the business is going, like what the next strategic move is, and then translating that back to my team to say, okay, this is kind of where we're going as a company. This is what it means for us as the design and product team on creators. So kind of giving them that context so they can make their decisions kind of in that context, and like having that shared information. And then managing down is mostly, like I said, keeping stuff off their tables, stuff that they don't need to see or need to know about, and then giving them strategic and design guidance. So they'll come back with something they're working on, and the feedback that I could give them, could either be like, yeah, move this here and make that pink, which is favorite thing to do. Um, but also like teaching them to step back and think about the larger context within which their work is going to live. Like, what does this mean strategically for or philosophically for someone you're designing this for? So kind of like, I think of myself as like, the pinwheel machines have those paddles. I'm basically nudging people. That's most of my job. Most of my job. And then, I'll pick up the slack when I need to. Like, I'll jump in and actually design. Sometimes you can't put stuff into words, and I'll have to get my hands dirty and like, make something so I can get the idea across. That's like 90% of what I do, I'd say.
So you're running interference from above so that they're not distracting your team, but then you're also like directing or nudging at, as you will, your designers. Just on a practical level, are there particular software tools you use, or like, I don't know, methodologies?
Um, Let me speak to methodologies first. So at the last few places, I think what's happened is like in the last, I want to say 5 to 7 years, product designers start to like gel into a discipline a little bit more than maybe it used to be back in my RGA days, right? And what's happened as a result of that is like we're starting to see this like standardization of tools and processes across companies. So last couple of jobs that I've been at, the the way people go about their design process, obviously like it depends on what you're trying to solve in that moment. Um, but the bones of the process haven't really changed. So like beginning with identifying an opportunity, whether it comes from, someone had an idea, or someone heard someone say something, or someone did research and has some insights that you want to move on. Starting there to then kind of evaluating that with people, concept testing, checking to see if this thing has legs, and then going super broad with um, explorations like, workshopping and like getting people to come up with a broad, you know, set of ideas, like honing in on one or two, developing those further, building them out, pushing it out, checking to see how it does, and then just like wash, rinse, repeat. That doesn't change. Um, but from like team to team, how quickly people do this and how exactly they do this and what tools they use to do this, that might change a little bit. And we tend to give teams that autonomy. So if you come down to software tools, about, I want to say a couple years ago was Sketch and something to manage Sketch. So like Sketch and Abstract, for example, for the file management. Now we're in Figma, like everyone's in Figma because like Figma has like inherent file management capabilities and a little bit of prototyping. So like back in the day, it used to be Sketch, Abstract, and then InVision because you want to make things move, or like Principle. Now it's all Figma, and then what Figma can't do, you'll probably do in Principle, or any other like prototyping
Mhm.
software like Origami, or actually take it into motion design tools if you need to.
So does everyone in a medium use Figma, or is that just team by team?
It's across the board. So the reason we chose to go that route, and I think most companies do this, which is like, let's find one baseline piece of software, because everyone's now collaborating. Everyone's in your files, you're in their files, you're sharing. Like file sharing is not a thing anymore. You just like jump into each other's stuff and like move things around. Um, and so having just that shared knowledge and shared skill set, I think we impose that. Like that's the baseline. Everything outside of that is up for grabs. You can use whatever else you want on top of it, but Figma is the baseline.
That's a sort of philosophically, that's a shift in the industry over the last few decades where you don't have your own files anymore.
This is
You
true.
work on files, but so does everyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nothing lives on my machine anymore. There's no chance of like things getting lost anymore. It's like philosophically, if you step back, the way I think about my work also has changed because of that. It's like this is not my file. This is a piece of work that I started, but then I'm gonna have other people help me out with it, and they might take it forward. And so, funnily enough, like you tend to get less territorial and maybe less sensitive about feedback and change and um, things you might not agree with because you can actually like see them moving and changing and getting better. It's a cool shift.
So, so it takes a village to design a UI. Is that
Designed by committee, not so bad anymore.
as long as as long as the committee's all designers? Um,
Uh, very
that,
touchy topic, but I'll get to it in a second.
okay. Um, so I'm curious, how did you first get into design? Like, was there a particular thing you saw or experienced that like sparked your interest? Or did you like fall into it by accident? A lot of designers do.
Yeah, I want to say it was a combination of things. So I think by training, like early on, I was a scientist, then engineer, maybe. And so I was in engineering school, like I guess undergrad, 4 years of engineering, and realized very early on that I could not be like a software developer professionally. Like that's just not me. I could write code, no problem, but I didn't want to do it as a thing that I did, right? Um, Design was always a thing on the side. I didn't recognize it for what it was. You know, as a lot of people tend to do, like they express themselves visually, like on paper. And I didn't realize it was a tool or like a thing until I began to apply it to solve problems. It was earlier on, it was more art. It was just like expression. I have this thing in my head, I want to put it on paper. But then when you realize that you can actually use like form and color and symmetry and rhythm and composition to start to solve problems like information design problems, for example, most fundamentally, like that's where I began with like poster design or design covers for magazines. And that I was in engineering school, I'm like, okay, I need to find an alternative path. So me getting into design had a lot to do with what I didn't want to do versus what I wanted to do. I don't want to do this thing that I'm studying for, like I'm going to school for. So what can I do? And so I began to like grab at any kind of like quote unquote thing that I could design. Um, and I fell into publishing. So I joined a 4-person. I was still in school when I joined like a 4-person startup, a magazine startup. They were putting out a magazine, and I would deliver magazines door to door after school, so that the creative director would just let me sit and watch him in the evenings when he was working, because he wouldn't let me touch anything because I didn't know anything. I was just a kid. And so that's kind of how I built my portfolio over the span of like 2 years. Began to work on small things, and then applied to Parsons as like, yeah, I'm just gonna. It was like a Hail Mary for me, and it worked. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. And even after I got into like Parsons and like into the job market in New York City, a lot of it was just self-discovery, like try everything and then learn what you don't want to do, so then you can then like adaptive path your way to maybe what you do want to do. I'm still doing that, but it's been fun, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, when you try everything, you're trying it with the knowledge that some of it you're not going to like.
Yeah.
You don't just try things you like ahead of time. You're like I really enjoy that idea that let's try everything and figure out what we don't like and then move in the direction of the other stuff. And over time, you refine that process and you end up with a path. Um,
Yeah.
and then like UX design, do you see that as design or engineering, or is it actually a combination of both?
I ask myself that question every day. So here's the thing, like if you come from like traditional design, and I was about to say design thinking, but I pulled back because design thinking is a thing that like I guess business school wonks came up with to make it palatable to non-designers. To just say, hey, there's like a method to this madness, which is, you know, part of my tension with it. But like the thing that I struggle with, or like a lot of my job really is defining the role of design in the context of technology. And there's a tension there, even though most people might not feel it because, you know, newer people kind of coming into design have always seen it in that context. Like, yeah, design for software, right? I'm like, no, well, fundamentally, if you like peel it all the way back, design and software development, like there's tension there because design, a lot of it is about like big picture or like going really deep, whereas, and then iterating or like, you know, honing it before you like put the thing out. Whereas software is, you know, at least if you talk about software development, you know, like agile and all of those things, it's like, yeah, what's the smallest thing that we can put out really quickly and then we can iterate on it? And I'm like, well, it's unfinished. So like, how do you kind of, you know, solve that? And so I'm constantly trying to figure out a balance there. And so what is UX? So UX actually is trying to find like UX design or like product design is trying to find that balance. Um, Educating the other disciplines as to like what makes good design and what it takes to get there, while also understanding that things like scale and speed and like, you know, time to value are important in the context of technology, right? So if you can find that balance, I think that's basically what UX design is trying to do.
UX design, I don't know, I feel like particularly in the business world that you just mentioned, like people come up with all kinds of definitions for what user experience is. User experience is part of branding. Well, okay, sort of. User experience is just UI. Well, not really.
So
There's a lot of definitions of UX. Is there like, I don't know, is there a prevailing definition that you're like, yeah, that's the definition of it, or do you think, you know what, whatever you think it is, it probably is?
yeah, UX does like, yeah, it's like love, you know. It is what you make it. Um,
You know it when you see it, kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. I'm like, is it solving the problem? If it's solving the problem, and yeah, that's it. Like that's design. It, I, you know what? I'm just gonna say no. There's pushback on the definition. Don't try to define it. Just put your head down and do your job. That's usually my response to people.
That's funny. So, okay, so there's this like tension between design and technology on some level.
Yeah,
There's a tension between design and business, I think.
yeah.
Um, what do you see as the challenges that designers need to be aware of in the design industry or in the UX industry? But I guess it is now an industry. Like, what are challenges that you're seeing, and maybe they're bigger than those tensions? What do you think of the big challenges right now?
It's like a 2-second question for like a 2-hour response, man.
We'll have you
Um,
come back.
let's see. I mean, there are like, I guess, worrying things that I see with like new designers coming into the space, which I feel like are challenges in their own right. Like if those are things that they're aware of coming in, I think that would be good for them. That would be good for the industry in general. But if I were to like, if you were to ask me like, okay, what are the things you're seeing that are challenging or worrying with the industry in general as it stands right now, I would say just this push to turn design into a science in some way, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and what I mean by that is this like, can we bottle this? Can we scale this? Is there a pattern for this? Is there a template? And it just takes, it like squeezes out all of like the fuzziness and the creativity of what, you know, makes good design in some way. Um, it is very rare. You'd be, I don't know, you probably know this already, but like when we look at new designers, when I say we, I don't mean this medium, I just mean like as designers in the industry, like no matter where you work, you'd be surprised to know that like visual design is almost like a secondary skill set.
Hmm.
It's strange because you walk into a company, there's already an established library of like UI and patterns and all of that. And essentially what the designer is doing is then just like pulling all of these together. Like you have the ingredients, you have to make something with it that's palatable. And so you don't always have to know how to create the components, because creating the component needs visual design, needs like original thinking, needs you to be able to start with a blank canvas. And that is not a required skill set anymore.
Hmm.
And so, you know, a designer is typically thinking in terms of, I look at a page or I look at a problem to solve, I'm immediately reaching for what patterns exist already. You know, how can I repurpose something? And that's not happening. I mean, there are pros to that, obviously, because you know you don't want to reinvent the wheel each single time. But at the same time, you know, you're doing this because you want things to scale. You're doing this because you want them to, you know, you want to get to an end result quickly. But and you rarely have enough time to like sit back and be like, okay, if I were to do this, you know, from first principles, like what would I do? And that is a question that is rarely asked. And I think that's because we're trying to kind of bottle this. Everything is like repurpose
Hmm.
everything else. And so designers are like losing that skill. And that's a trend. That's a worrying trend. Everything looks like everything else. Nothing's new or interesting after a point. Um, so that's one. The other thing is, the other one is speed, right? And because you're trying to move so quickly, sometimes the speed basically means if there is speed, then there's a lack of rigor. And a lack of rigor means you're not examining the knock-on effects of like this one change that you make to a fairly complex system. And you know, small changes on a platform that is serving, you know, upwards of 100 million people can have tremendous, you know, consequences, both positive and negative. And sometimes, in most cases, design teams or, you know, processes are don't account for or cannot account for those knock-on effects. There just isn't time built in to check for those. And sometimes it's just not possible to check for those. Like you cannot simulate what this is going to mean to 100 million people, of which there might be a segment that you did not think about. So yeah, those are things, those are challenges.
So I so you're the first thing you mentioned about how, you know, things are kind of like we're trying to bottle design,
Yeah.
right? And I feel like that push is coming from two sides, or at least two, but here's two it's coming from. One is business, where we try to systemize things, and there are benefits to systemizing branding so that there's consistency in how we understand things, right? Um, and so there are benefits there. I do think that too often there isn't enough room for creativity, but that that's when business is taking precedent over design. But the other side that's trying to bottle stuff is frankly my side as a professor, right? Because how do we teach design? We do teach principles,
Yeah.
but then here's all the tools we're using to teach too. And so like the process of teaching, we don't want to crush creativity, but we are at least trying to teach some skills and underlying thinking and so on. And a lot of times stuff does end up looking similar.
Yep.
So you're blaming me, aren't you? It's my fault. And no, it's a challenge I have too, because I don't want to crush creativity out of people. But you still have to teach them the frameworks. So
yeah, it's all like, I think everything comes down to like balance. And I think the thing that I'm responding to mostly is that when you start to push, like on a spectrum, whenever you start to push too much to one side, you have a problem. I am not saying for a minute that when designers are designing, especially for software, you always start with a blank page. That's just not going to work. It doesn't make any sense. That would mean that every page that the user sees now is different from the page that they just looked at, which is insane, right? But when you try to bottle it to the extent that if this is the problem you're trying to solve, this is the only way you solve it, or like you can solve it in one of these three ways. When you get it down to like if this then that, then we have a problem, because it might speed up things like task completion, but at the same time, like, does this feel like an ownable, unique, differentiated experience that your product is offering, that I would come to this versus someone else? I think that's what I'm pushing back against. That's definitely a trend.
And I think that's a constant balance. It's a tightrope kind of balance, because you're moving forward, but you're always walking this line. And then the second thing, speed versus rigor. And you mentioned, making a change on a system where there's, 100,000 or 100 million people using that system. There's no way to simulate what the effects are. That's a tough one. How, like, I'm assuming you do some testing, but in the business world, there's, I don't know, focus groups and all this stuff. And before technology was this big, we used to spend a lot of time analyzing small changes and studying, I don't know, like when blue M&Ms came out, like there were so many focus groups about the particular shade of blue. Like, really? But now we're making like small changes that actually affect people's experience, and we don't have that same impact. How do we deal with that as designers?
There is no, like, I don't know, there's a simple answer. The thing that I'm calling attention to is, I think we do testing, and testing will reveal maybe the first order impact or effect of something that you've done. Like, I do this and so this happens, and like that's an interesting outcome, or that's an unexpected outcome, but that is still positive, or it's negative, but we're okay with it. I think the part that you're not necessarily able to put your finger on or capture is like what happens, like what's the ripple effect of that change. And there's no simple way to catch it or accommodate for it, except that as a designer, just like spending the time to think it through. Designing in the context of a system as opposed to designing in silos. I mean, this sounds like textbook, but you'd be surprised to see how many organizations are like designing in silos and then communicating to like update each other, but they're just, the updates are very thin. They're like, I made this change. Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that you made this change. What they're not talking about is, I made this change and this is what it sits in your system, and your system sits inside of like 5 other systems, and this is what might happen as a result of that. That conversation almost never happens. And coming up with a basically like room in your roadmap to have that discussion, and like just a stub for conversation, if nothing else, and then time to try to just talk through some of this stuff. Like, for example, like, an analogy might be, you as a company are putting out a statement. You're doing something, you're coming up with a press release. Now, part of what the communications team does is anticipate the questions you're going to get and the different ways in which your statement is going to be interpreted. And then you have a laundry list of responses, right? These are all the things that we might do. Um, we don't do that with software, at least not
Mhm.
rigorously enough. And I think making room for that, especially if you're working on a highly networked, highly interconnected piece of software or technology, I think that's crucial.
I think this would apply in any field of design, really. Like the design process is not just, okay, we're gonna brainstorm and then we're gonna sketch and then we're going to do some rounds of iterations and then we're gonna have a final product. Then there's another step or two or three past that, which is, did it work? What are the ripple effects? And maybe how can we improve it next time? Like it's sort of a debrief afterwards of the effects of it. And I feel like we go up to the production and then we send it out into the world and then we're on to the next project.
Yep, that's true of every single place, tends to be, no matter how big or small.
That, of course, if your boss isn't giving you the time and the money to do that, then you're not going to do it out of your own goodwill, probably.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is like the intention is there, but it doesn't always translate into action.
Gotcha. So those, I mean, that really is a key challenge. And um, we try to do some of the iteration before we're done with the project. But once the project, even in classes, once the project is done, we don't really talk about it anymore. We're on to the next project. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind once people are getting out into the real world. So as students are, like I can see just in our student list here, we've got some graphic design students, web design students, UX students. I think there's a couple even folks interested in animation and like 3D, AR, VR kind of stuff. But like, what advice would you give to a college student? Or what advice do you wish someone had given you before you got into these fields?
That's interesting. I mean, honestly, like it's, yeah. In fact, like not knowing what I was doing has helped a lot, weirdly. Just because I'd like walk into a situation and be like, I'm not quite sure what I'm expected to be like doing in this situation, but I'm just going to do what I think is right and then see where it goes and just be open to the idea that I'm going to screw up completely. That helped just because, being an engineering student thrown into like a design context, it just takes a second to realize that no one else knows what they're doing either. And that's okay, because this hasn't been done before. And that's fantastic. One of the things that one of my first mentors at RGA, like she told me was try to find out what you're good at and try to build a kind of personal brand or equity around that thing, so that whenever something related to that thing comes up, your name's at the top of that pile. Like, oh, we have like data viz was my thing when I got out of Parsons, and I was, I focused my thesis on that. I worked at the data viz lab there. And so when I got to RGA, they were doing a lot of, when I got sucked into like the RGA, like Nike digital sport machine, early days of like Nike running, and then, Nike plus training, and like I worked on all of those things, right? And even first versions of some of those apps. Data viz was a thing. Like, you had dashboards, like the quantified self was like starting to peak at that time. And so, oh yeah, data viz, let's ask Ritwik, because, he seems to have that as a skill set. Like he wears that on his chest. And so like, we should just go grab him because he'll do it. I think knowing that, or like knowing to do that, going into a space is a good thing, maybe. The other thing I've realized is that design takes, like being a designer on a team takes a ton of courage. And I'm personally like, I tend to be like in a room full of people that I don't know, I tend to be quiet. I'm, fairly introverted. Um, and so I realized like as the designer on the team, it is literally my job to stand up in front of a room full of people and try to convince them that we should solve this in this way. I had an idea. This is my idea. Feel free to disagree with me. And that is incredibly hard to do. And just like knowing that that's going to be your job every day would have been a good thing just to like know getting in. You stand
Yeah.
up there, you hold up the thing, and then everyone has an opinion because they do. And everyone's a designer, which is also true at so many levels. Um, so yeah, I think those things, and kind of tying back to like I didn't know what I was doing, and I still don't sometimes. Just knowing that like design is a team sport, I think is super helpful. And a team sport, not that, oh, you're a designer, there's like five other designers and you need to know like your superpowers and your kryptonite, and you can find, the guy who compliments you or the girl who works best with you, and then like, work with them. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is everyone's a designer. Anyone can have an idea, and it's kind of your job to like draw it out and turn it into a thing and then work with this person. It's very much about like you're the Rosetta Stone in some way, like you're always translating and like being the conduit, and just like knowing that that's your job, and it's not just about pushing pixels, it's about translating ideas into tangible things. I think that would be good to know, like just going in.
Yeah, you are. Everyone is a designer. The truth is, everyone does design. The real question is, are they doing it intentionally?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Or not? Everyone's doing user experience. Are you doing it intentionally or not? And your job as the designer is to deal with the client, whether that's an external client or in-house or whatever, and translate. I love that idea that you're the Rosetta Stone. You're the translator, the conduit through which ideas are coming and getting converted into product, into design. I really like that idea. And your idea, having courage to stand in front of people and show off your work, that is very brave. It comes naturally to some people. I don't think it comes naturally to you and I. Like I used to be at least the guy I'd be the wallflower, right? And it took several years as a designer before I could stand in front of people and show off my work and accept criticism.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like when I got into the design field, or like actually like working professionally, like I was still like my accent was thicker. I didn't speak American that well. It was kind of hard. It's easier now, but um yeah, I will, not occasionally, actually pretty frequently go up in front of people and be like tongue tied because there's all of this stuff and my mouth can't keep up with my brain sometimes. And yeah, I think it's good to know that that's a skill you have to develop as you do this.
So I have a question from a student. What are some questions you ask yourself or your clients to help you with this translation of ideas into design?
um I think I think a big part of it is just, I wouldn't say just because it's not trivial, but a big part of it is empathy. And it's not, there's a whole set of questions you can ask them about, like, why are we doing this? And, what is this trying to solve? Like, those are textbook questions. Like, what are you trying to get out of this? Like, who is this for? What does success mean to you? Like, these are like almost evaluative questions. You're trying to get to the root cause of something.
Mhm.
But I think more fundamental to that is, who is your client? Where are they coming from? Like, why are they doing that? Like, these are questions you kind of have to ask yourself if you know the answers to. Like if I don't know Tor or like the company that he's running, I cannot design for him. Um, like why does he want to do this? Like why do we need to do this as separate? Like why does the business need to do this? But like why does Tor want to do this? Like where does he see this? Why does he think of this in this way? Um, why does he think this particular execution or solution is good versus that one? Like what are his biases? What's his context? I think those are things that I try to understand. And in my case, at least for the last several years, my clients have not been external. They've been internal, like within the company. Or in a lot of cases, I'm having this conversation with my engineers because I'm like, they want to do, wanted to solve this problem in this way. And I'm like, well, where are you coming from? Like, why do you think this is right? Um, if that helps answer that question. I know I rambled a little bit, but I think it's just trying to get to understand where this person is coming from before you try to get to um, the tactical solution.
Mhm. I think it is a lack of a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding where people are coming from, that kind of leads us to the thing you were talking about before, where we just have libraries of approaches and we just rearrange the same crap we did before to give you a solution. And that's why it ends up looking like all the other solutions we gave everybody else. It's because we didn't have empathy for you. We didn't actually take the time to understand our client or the client's clients when we were working on it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
So do you have favorite designers that you follow or that you suggest students take a look at?
Oh man, I'm the worst person to ask that question. And the reason I say that is because I'm notorious for, I don't know if this is a mixture of like laziness and arrogance in some way, or like some sort of like personal philosophy where at some point, I don't know when this happened, but like I just believe that the best way for you to grow and develop is through the work. And that's why I have an aversion to like people who only talk about it but have never designed anything in their lives. Right? Like there's a lot of like these people that you will bump into at conferences and like are up on stage and are talking about, and a lot of these people, I mean, honestly, a lot of what they talk about is probably great and you should listen to them. Nothing against any of these people. But if they haven't actually produced the work, like they haven't learned this through doing the work, then I have a problem with that. So I don't know where that comes from, but what that translates to in my life then is I spend all of my, like, I guess my non-family time actually like doing the work and not reading about the work or looking at other people who are doing the work, which is not maybe a good thing. There's a balance to be found there. And so what that means is tactically that my Twitter feed is not like a bunch of designers that I follow. I don't have a news aggregator that is subscribed to like all the best design blogs. I don't have like a dozen publications coming in every week or every month that are like design pubs that I look at. I don't do any of that. I just try to solve the problem in front of me and then like I'll learn something there, and maybe I'll bump into people or like people on teams are my inspiration. Like I'll work somewhere, I'll meet someone who's done some amazing work, they know someone, and then I'll talk to them and they'll turn me on to someone else. And that's how like it's always through the work as opposed to like I'm going to step back and Google XYZ to find who's doing what in what space. That said, I think Mike Montero keeps popping up as my go-to guy because he's I tell people this, he's like the Lewis Black of design. He is so angry all the time, and I think he's angry for the right reasons, and a lot of the stuff that he brings up, those are like things that resonate with me. So if students here haven't heard of him, I would encourage you to go check him out. Two of his talks that are like favorites of mine, one is How Designers Destroyed the World, is one. It's a classic. I think it's on TED. And there's a newer one, which I actually have forgotten the name of, but pretty easy to find.
Okay. So So how do you get inspired then? Or like, do you just take time to sketch through a whole bunch of ideas? Do you take long hikes in the woods? You
In New York
know,
City, yeah. Um,
living there in New York City.
um, yeah, sketch a ton. This is where the arrogance piece comes in. It's like, I'm just gonna do this from first principles and see where I land before I look sideways to see what other people have done. It's a way of like, it's a way for me to keep myself sharp, and it's also a way for me to like get affirmation that if I'm going down this path, like, let me go down this path first, see how I would define for myself how I might solve something before I look to see how someone else has. Um, Inspiration, in a lot of cases, like I'll do some design research, but it's mostly looking at the product as opposed to looking for the person that made the product.
Hmm.
Um, so who else is in this space? Who's playing in this space? More like a competitive analysis as opposed to like, and then using what I find there as inspiration instead of like, I know these 5 designers, let's see what they've done and see if that's inspiring, if that makes sense. And then there's like people on my team. I've I continue to work with some very, very, incredibly talented people. And sometimes getting in a room with a couple of them with, which of course doesn't happen anymore. We call it IZL as opposed to IRL now, and just like sketching and sharing ideas. That's where most of my inspiration comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you get together with other designers in a Zoom COVID world? It's hard.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious to learn what tools you've been using, but I think for us it's just been, we'll fire up Miro, sketch on a piece of paper, take a picture, drop it in, and just, that's kind of how we go about stuff.
Yeah, yeah. We like when I have students do critiques, um, it's like you got to take a picture of this thing and stick it up in the cloud so we can all look at it. Um, it's not as easy as just pushing it across the table or putting it up on the board and we all get to see it. It's just not the same.
Yeah.
Um, there are benefits in a sense, like different people can be looking at it in different ways then. Like we're all looking at this link and I'm zooming in on this corner, someone else is zooming in on that corner. So that's, you couldn't do that in real life in the same way, but it doesn't have quite the dynamism or the interactivity between people that
Yeah.
we can have.
Yeah. Like the introvert in me kind of appreciates that to some extent because, and I don't know if like how many of you people in this room have had this, but like you're in like a design critique session, your work is being critiqued, or you're the one who's offering up the critique. And oftentimes I'm looking at very complex things, and I have a few seconds or like a few minutes to come back with a meaningful response that is actually going to move the work forward um, significantly. And it's too much to ask. And so I do appreciate, you know, the work being put up somewhere. I'm looking at it, but then I can also buy myself some time to, I'll get off camera, or I'll literally say, you know what, I'll come back to you on this, and spend some heads down time, like really coming up with a thoughtful response as opposed to something that would be like a knee jerk, uh, you know,
Hmm.
not so meaningful bit of criticism.
Hmm. I have a question from a student. Is there a method you have to communicate with your design team what you want that works best for you, like combination of concept sketching or presenting or just verbal, like when you're starting a project from scratch?
Is this um, is this them sending stuff over to me, or is this me giving them feedback?
You're introducing, uh, a, you're telling your design team a new project that you need designed, or you're explaining that. Is it just getting together on Zoom like this? Do you do concept sketches for them?
Hmm. I mean, typically it's a conversation at the start. Um, and I So, we'll get together, we'll discuss the concept, we'll get super clear on what it is that we're trying to solve. We'll try to examine different like angles that you could come at this from, just make sure everyone's on the same page. And like, we'll talk about research and stuff. But when it comes time to start to produce stuff, uh, the one thing I will be super careful about when I'm briefing designers is that I will try not to suggest solutions. I'll try to stay out of solutioning in this like initial, like, let's get on the same page moment, because it's very easy for me to put into words or put into a sketch what I'm seeing in my head right now.
Interesting.
And I want to have them take a first crack at it. Like, it's also like I don't want to bias them. At the same time, I don't want to be biased myself. So I'm like, just yeah, okay, we know what this is. Um, let's come back with some ideas. And then they'll come back with either like again, a response could be in words because they're like still trying to kind of firm up the problem space a little bit, or it might be sketches. At which point, like my response could again be words, or I'm like, okay, this is going to be too hard in words. So I'm just going to get into your file if it's something I can manipulate, or I will just, sketch in my notebook and then we're going to go from there.
So you start out sort of explaining the problem or the opportunity,
Yeah.
without really getting like prescribing a solution yet.
Yep. Most important for me, at
You
least.
let them come up with the solutions. I really like that. It lets people have a little more creativity and not just be cookie cutter like we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah. And I think a big part of like being a designer, or like being, feeling fulfilled as a designer, is to have that autonomy. And if my team constantly feels that I'm feeding them solutions that they are just going to then execute on, they wouldn't stick around for very long, or they would stick around but they wouldn't grow very much. And um yeah, neither of those are good outcomes for me. So yeah, uh give them as much rope as I possibly can. Sometimes it's hard as a manager because you kind of know how to solve it. You have to watch someone stumble through getting there. But what almost always ends up happening is a combination of what they come up with and what's in my head is better than what either of us would have come up with by ourselves. So
That's a really good point. So we have about 5 minutes here. Uh, I've had a couple of questions from students. Are there any other questions that people have? Ritwik, do you have any parting words for students? This is your one sentence of advice.
uh let's see, what have I not said already?
You've covered a lot.
Yeah, and I know I feel like I've kind of like Brownian motioned my way across a lot of stuff, but I'm not sure it made a lot of sense. um yeah, I think at the end of the day, um maybe just try not to take yourself too seriously, I think is super important.
Hmm.
Because like I said, everyone's a designer. You just happen to be one that went to school or is in school now. um and so you should maybe hold yourself to a high standard, but at the same time, when you can't meet it, that's fine. You'll get there. It's okay. And whenever you get stuck, I try to unstick myself, like I said, through the work. um just keep doing the thing, and you'll get through to the other side. What's really hard is analyzing yourself into like inaction in some ways.
The paralysis of analysis.
Paralysis of analysis. One other thing. This is going to make me sound like an old man, but I'm going to say it anyway. um I think, I mean, this has always been the case with like corporate culture and like moving, like the race to the top, and everyone wants to like you know get to the top of whatever like their career path is, like very quickly, and all of those things. And I've there's always this like leadership is a thing. You walk into a space, you want to lead. And I think people have forgotten how to follow. It's something that I've been toying with this idea. I think it's incredibly important to follow. Like don't know how to follow, because like I've I run into people all the time. Some of them who haven't like put in the time to do the work yet, uh, who are not doing anything because they want to do their own thing. They want to lead. They're waiting for this idea to come to them. And in this time that they're waiting, they could use their skills as designers to support someone else's idea. Someone has a good idea. It's not your idea, it's their idea, and it's okay. Like put your back into that and support them while you wait for your idea to become a thing. And I think because all the conversations we hear, like you look at LinkedIn, you look at the news, you read, it's all about like this person did this thing and at the top and they're leading. People have forgotten to be like instruments of change. They just want to be the change. They don't want to be the instrument that makes the change happen. I don't think that's and I think that's not a good place to be, or like a good thing to do with the time that you have and the skills that you have, because someone could use them.
Well, I think you learn a lot helping someone else achieve their idea. You learn about how to achieve your own ideas.
Yeah. You shouldn't like analysis paralysis is one thing, but there's like this arrogance or like waiting for your idea, for lightning to strike, just wasting time. Just keep working while you do that on the side.
Well, I love that idea. And I think we are now out of time. Ritwik, this has been awesome. I really appreciate all your commentary. Levi says here, I really like this talk. You're funny, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Learning to follow was super helpful. So thank you, everybody. We'll post the recording up on the DTC website later, so stay tuned for that. And thank you again, Ritwik. Everyone have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.